The last box leaves in the trunk of a car, and the door closes behind it. The house is suddenly completely quiet. Not the quiet of a nap or an early morning, but a different kind, heavier somehow, one that feels like it might just stay this way now. You sit down across from your spouse at dinner that first night, and for a moment, neither of you says much. For 20 years, the conversation had a built-in subject. Tonight, it doesn't, and the silence feels louder than it should. You catch yourself wondering, quietly, who exactly you two are now, without a schedule built around someone else's practice, homework, or curfew. You've been the parents together for so long that the question feels strange even to ask. Maybe you've heard the warnings for years that this is when marriages quietly fall apart. Once the kids are gone and there's nothing left holding two people together except habit and an empty house. So you brace for it a little some nights. You watch for distance, for irritation, for the two of you drifting into separate routines under the same roof, waiting for the moment the marriage itself starts to feel just as empty as the rooms upstairs. So here's the honest question worth asking. Is that fear actually what usually happens? Or is there something researchers have found that almost nobody, including you, ever really hears about? Here's the first thing worth knowing. You are far from alone in dreading this exact moment. Millions of couples brace for the same thing when the last child leaves, and most of them have never heard what the research actually says happens next. Because here's what almost nobody tells you honestly. For a striking number of couples, the story that follows isn't a marriage falling apart at all. It's something researchers describe, almost like clockwork, as a genuine turning point instead. Psychologist Robert Levenson at UC Berkeley has spent years following baby boomer couples through exactly this transition, tracking their relationships closely, year after year, as their children grew up and eventually moved out on their own. According to this long-running research, most parents in his studies weren't sliding into a quiet, disconnected marriage once the house emptied out. Many describe something closer to what researchers have called a genuine renaissance in their relationship. Wives, in particular, according to this research, often reported meaningfully higher marital satisfaction once the children had moved out, not lower, the way the popular warnings had led so many of them to expect for years. Researchers actually have a name for this overall pattern, the U-shaped curve of marital satisfaction. Happiness is often highest early on, dips noticeably through the long, demanding years of raising children, and then genuinely rises again once the house empties out. Think about what that dip usually involves, if you're honest about it. Years of split attention, exhaustion, logistics, conversations interrupted mid-sentence by a child needing something right now, connection squeezed into whatever minutes were left over. So when those demands finally lift, according to this research, many couples don't drift apart the way they feared. They rediscover each other instead. The version of the relationship that existed before parenting became the loudest thing in the room. That's not a small emotional shift. And it's not simply nostalgia talking either. It's measurable. According to researchers who've tracked satisfaction scores directly, couple by couple, across years, rather than relying on guesswork or vague impressions. Now, to be fully honest, this pattern isn't automatic or guaranteed for every single couple, and no honest video should pretend otherwise. Researchers are careful about this part, and it matters enough to say clearly. For couples who are already struggling before the kids left, carrying real unresolved tension underneath the daily busyness, the empty nest can do the opposite. One long running study found satisfaction actually dropped by roughly a third for couples already in difficulty. In those cases, researchers suggest parenting had likely been quietly holding two people together, giving them a shared project that distracted from harder, more personal problems sitting underneath the surface the whole time. So the empty nest doesn't create a marriage's problems, according to this research. It removes the noise that was covering them up, which can feel like collapse in the moment, even though what's actually happening is closer to exposure. Which means the real question was never really, will the empty nest ruin my marriage? It's closer to this. What was actually underneath the daily noise of parenting for you specifically this whole time? For a striking number of couples, according to Levenson's research, what's underneath is something worth genuinely rediscovering. Long forgotten inside jokes, shared interests, a version of curiosity about each other that simply got buried under carpool schedules. That first quiet dinner, the one that felt too silent. Some researchers would say that silence isn't necessarily a warning sign at all. It might simply be the sound of a conversation waiting to become about something new again. So maybe the quiet in that house isn't absence. Maybe it's space for exactly the kind of undivided attention toward each other that simply wasn't available for the last 20 years of school runs and late night homework. This doesn't mean every difficult conversation magically disappears, and it doesn't mean you won't have real, sometimes painful work to do figuring out who you are together now. Both things apparently are allowed to be true here. But according to a genuinely encouraging number of long-term studies, the odds here are considerably better than the warnings ever let on. More couples report growing closer through this exact transition than the popular story about empty nest marriages actually suggests. So if you're bracing for distance right now, sitting across from someone you've raised an entire family with, maybe it's worth trying something different tonight instead. Asking a question you haven't asked them in years. Not about the kids, not about logistics, something closer to who they become. Quietly, underneath all that parenting, the same kind of question you might have asked on one of your very first dates together. That quiet house isn't necessarily the ending researchers once assumed it was either. For plenty of couples, according to this same body of work, it's closer to an actual beginning, arriving right when you least expected one. Trust that possibility a little more than the warnings you've been carrying for years. The research genuinely suggests it's earned far more often than most people are ever told, sitting quietly in an empty house wondering what comes next. You're not necessarily losing each other in that silence, quietly and passively. In some very real, well-documented ways, you might simply be getting the chance, for the first time in decades, to actually find each other again. If you've ever sat across from your spouse in a suddenly quiet house and wondered what happens next, this next part is for you. There are millions of people in their 50s and 60s going through exactly what you're going through. Most of them have never heard it explained this way. That's what this channel is for. Real psychology, honest conversations. No pretending that this chapter of life is simple. If this helped you, subscribe. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them.